BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Black Box Ned 88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to our monthly Zodiac Killer Q&A session. It is only the beginning of the month of July, but I thought we would get right to it this month because you guys were sending in a whole lot of comments about the Zodiac Killer, and there are a lot of things that we can talk about. I mean, thank you to everyone who has listened to our upload here on this channel about Don Chaney as a Zodiac Killer suspect. I mean, I think that Don Chaney is someone who is a much more likely suspect than a lot of the people out there, even some of the ones that we've covered on this channel. But I would just like to jump right in and start reading off some of your questions and comments about the Zodiac Killer, and let's have a bit of a discussion. Our first one comes to us from Gunslinger221. You make some really good points. Read the book as well. Not sure it was Don Chaney, but he was involved in this for sure. Thanks for the information, and it really gets you thinking. The book talks about too many things that cannot be just a coincidence. And the book, of course, that he's talking about is Sighting In on the Zodiac Killer by Drew Beeson. Looking at Don Chaney as a suspect, he was, of course, the friend of Arthur Lee Allen. Robert Graysmith cited him many times in his books about how Don Chaney is just this window into Arthur Lee Allen's life. He said this, he said that. He uses him for a lot of hearsay evidence. The book talks about too many things that cannot be a coincidence. And when you look at a suspect like Don Chaney, he goes against a lot of the things that we've said about the group murder theory and the Zodiac Killer hoax theory. We talk about those things a lot on this channel. But with Don Chaney, he matches the psychological profile almost perfectly. And I do mean that because if you listen to people, like we did an expose on Dr. Todd Grande's psychological profile, we've also talked about Sharon Hagen's psychological profile, and both of them are almost in consensus. It's almost like perfectly coinciding. They're like, the Zodiac Killer was someone who had stable employment. He was most likely working some type of a 9-to-5 or thereabouts, a person of above average intelligence, an underachiever, someone who felt that he didn't get the recognition that he deserved. Possibly sociopathic, but perhaps just a different type of narcissist, as well as someone who was not only intelligent, but familiar with mathematics, perhaps working a solitary job. Maybe he had been arrested for a few other criminal offenses. And one of the things that these psychologists are saying is that they believe that the Zodiac Killer was also married, possibly a family man, but definitely married, because the crimes are occurring on nights, evenings, weekends, and holidays. And this is just the only time that a married man or a family man could get away from said wife and kids. Don Chaney would match all of those things, especially when I interviewed Drew Beeson here on this channel. If you haven't heard that, I would recommend it. And it's like, especially because he's talking about how Don Chaney could have composed the ciphers on a light table in his basement, and just hearing about a mechanical engineer like Don Chaney, a pipe stress analyst, working in the solitary way in his basement, he would have had all the know-how, all the abilities, as well as some of these coincidences. Don Chaney knew Paul Avery back from Bakersfield Junior College, and you hear so many things like that. He is so central to this, much more central. And this even goes back to a question that we've talked about before. Why did it take so long for Don Chaney to become a suspect? Which is also left on this upload, coming to us from Ben De La Torre. Well, simply that Chaney tried to vilify Arthur Lee Allen in that narrative. I mean, we don't know 100%, but Chaney wanted everybody to be looking at Arthur Lee Allen. He used him as a patsy. He had this guy that he knew people would dislike, and it's possible that Chaney and Arthur Lee Allen were never even real friends, but instead he was simply just a patsy. He was simply just using this guy because he wanted him to take the fall for his for being a suspect. Once again, he didn't want him convicted. If he had wanted convicted, Arthur Lee Allen convicted, he could have left a piece of Paul Stein's shirt on Arthur Lee Allen's property, which Don Chaney had access to. But if Arthur Lee Allen were to be convicted, no one would interview Don Chaney anymore, and Allen would get credit for the Zodiac Killer murders, which someone else committed. Now, the next comment comes to us from Remarkable Republican here on the same upload about Don Chaney. It was Robert Graysmith. That's what he says right there. And I have to be honest with you. It has crossed my mind at one point or another. Could Robert Graysmith have something to do with this? And if it hadn't been for Thomas Henry Horrod, I would say I would never, ever have thought that Robert Graysmith could have been involved in the murders. Thomas Henry Horrod accuses Robert Graysmith of being a disinfo agent. As we said, Don Chaney could have composed the ciphers on a light table in his basement. Thomas Horrod accuses Robert Graysmith of being an active participant in this theory, what he calls the Zodiac Killer hoax theory, the myth of the Zodiac Killer. And what we would say about that is that he accuses Graysmith not only of writing a book which contains a bunch of fabricated information, misleading statements, half a sentence comes from the police reports and the case files, the other half of the sentence is a pure fabrication. It's very difficult to find out where does the truth begin and end. That's what he accuses him of, number one. And number two, accusing Graysmith of being the author of the ciphers. Now, when it would come to Graysmith being the Zodiac Killer himself, I would really need some time to even digest that before we could ever make any type of genuine response. But I can say, though, that Graysmith has been heavily accused of being a disinfo agent. Now, we're going to move on to a different upload here. This was one that we actually did last year. It was for the anniversary of Lake Berryessa, the 50th anniversary of Lake Berryessa, I should say. And in this one, we have... we did a transcript reading where we were reading off the parts of the Zodiac Killer, Brian Hartnell, and Cecilia Ann Shepard. And this one comes to us from The Invisible Man. I feel the Lake Berryessa crime may have been a copycat. The other Zodiac crimes all took place at night, victims were shot in their car, and the killer never spoke to them. Conversely, Lake Berryessa was in the day. The victims were stabbed out in the open rather than shot in a car, and the killer spoke to the victims. Yes, he wore the Zodiac's logo on his costume, but this was after the Zodiac letters appeared in the paper, so everyone knew what the Zodiac's logo was. Also, Brian Hartnell's description of a man with long hair differs from Zodiac's typical widow's peak look. Whole lot of things to say right there. First and foremost, I had many of those same feelings, many of those same responses, and that was more about the stuff that I talked about in 2019 when I was saying that, doesn't it seem strange that the Zodiac only wore the hood one time? Or how about differentiating the method of execution, going from murdering somebody with a handgun to just deciding to stab the victims, as he said, who are out in the open? Lake Berryessa is very different. In a recent upload, though, we did address some of that. Whether you think this was a group of people or one person, I would still stand by one point. The killer took his time at Lake Berryessa for that reason. He had more time. The victims were in an area in which they couldn't escape from very easily. They also were not close to anybody, like witnesses were farther away than I would expect, especially in the case of Paul Stein, who was murdered in Presidio Heights. The Zodiac Killer simply had more time to operate. And of course, it was during the daytime, so the Zodiac wore the hood. If you're dealing with someone who was married and is just trying to sneak off, then perhaps that was the only time that he was available. Or perhaps indeed, if you were to talk about a group murder theory, then it was a different person. I would just like to say one thing, though, about when he says the letter was published in the paper. Yes, he wore the Zodiac's logo on his costume, but this was after the Zodiac letters appeared in the paper. Very specifically, that was August 4th, 1969. The Zodiac symbol was printed in the Vallejo Times-Herald. So, anyone who had read that newspaper, anyone in Vallejo would have had access to that symbol, and people have gone back and found that out. But I should also say, though, in the hoax theory with Thomas Henry Horrod, he says that his suspect is named Dennis Land, who was the park ranger at Lake Berryessa. And it's like, it is one of those things, though, that you do have to admit, like, if you're going to differentiate from a suspect like Don Chaney and then look at the Zodiac hoax theory, immediately You're going from one perpetrator to many perpetrators. You're going from a single individual to this little bit more complicated network, and it starts to become rather complex. So, so says me anyway, but I really have to think that it is somewhat of a simpler narrative dealing with Don Chaney versus the Zodiac hoax theory, or even the possibility of what we talked about recently with Hal Snook as a Zodiac killer suspect himself. Granted, I'm not the first person to say that. Somebody in the comments section even encouraged me to look into that as Hal Snook as the Zodiac Killer, and I would say, if you were going to entertain that idea, what you could say is, Hal Snook could have betrayed the confidential informants of the narcotics department, and Lake Berryessa would be once again a different person committed by Dennis Land or somebody else, and because Hal Snook and Dennis Land knew each other, and Dennis Land could have manipulated the situation in some way at Lake Berryessa. But the thing with that, no matter who your suspect is, one person or a group, Lake Herman Road, Blue Rock Springs, and the Paul Stein murder in Presidio Heights all took place in hotbeds of criminal activity, whereas Lake Berryessa did not. To the best of my knowledge, maybe some types of crimes happened there, such as the Lake Berryessa stabbing, but hotbeds of criminal activity. You could blame it on the drugs. You could blame it on people selling stolen goods at Blue Rock Springs Park. You could blame it on taxicab robberies in Presidio Heights. The perpetrator would have had an ability to always use somebody else as the fall guy or the target. And now, we're going to go on to another comment that comes into us on our upload, Zodiac Killer, Occult Connections and Possibilities. And this one is coming to us from Michael Jenkins. There is no doubt in my mind that there were different levels of possible cult influence. I'm not so certain that there is any complete absence of such in all aspects of society. That is the gist of the situation, in my estimation. And I think that that's a very important comment to talk about, because if we are dealing with any type of occult connection, like practicing witchcraft, or, Darlene Ferrin was even rumored to practice witchcraft. We also had somebody like Anton LaVey doing things with the Church of Satan in San Francisco at the time. Even if we're going to say that there are occult connections in the Zodiac Killer mystery, maybe they are much more interwoven than we thought. Maybe they aren't as blatant as people have given them credit for, or maybe they aren't as vivid and important as people are thinking. There could be genuinely an occult connection. And I would make the claim, even more valuable than the occult connections are the connections to literature. Look at the Mikado, for example. That's one, the most obvious. Then we also have the magazine that we talked about in the Don Harden upload we did recently, called Detective Story Magazine, which has a character called Z. This is Z speaking. We talked about Tim Holt in The Wheel of Death. The Most Dangerous Game, the film Bloodlust from 1961, or even The Exorcist Letter. Like, the Zodiac was much more dealing with literature rather than the occult connections. And Aleister Crowley was, brought up heavily in regard to the Zodiac Killer mystery. He was a writer, as well. So I think that the Zodiac Killer was much more about literature rather than the occult. It's not impossible that there are occult connections, no matter who your suspect is. I would actually like to go on to another upload that we did quite a while ago, and this one is called Zodiac Killer, Legends and Fantasy. And this comes to us from Psycho Mom 1227. I ran across a small piece on Unsolved Mysteries where two authors and reporters believed that Ted Kaczynski was the Zodiac. It's a far-out theory, but they made a few good points. I'm going to have to look further into it. And once again, this is somewhat of an older upload. But what I would say is that Ted Kaczynski was checked out, the Unabomber we're talking about, and it appears that he was out of the Bay Area on certain incidents in Zodiac activity. That's one of the reasons why I haven't done a formal upload about him, because I was just like, it appeared that he wasn't in the Bay Area for all of these different incidents in Zodiac activity. So I think I would have to leave it at that unless we saw something new. And this was the next comment that I would like to read is from our upload, Zodiac Killer Hoax Theory. There was no Zodiac Killer. I made this upload last year in 2019 because some people were leaving these comments on my uploads talking about the Zodiac Killer hoax theory. I never had heard of Thomas Henry Horan. I had no idea who he was, but they're, writing out very lengthy comments saying there was no Zodiac Killer. Some guy was just writing letters, taking credit for murders that he didn't commit, whom I've since learned the person they accuse is named Hal Snook. But I was like, so I did a response to that, to some of the claims that people were sending me. And one of the people who left a comment here was simply saying that also, just about everything the Zodiac Killer hoax guy named Thomas Horan, actually it's spelled Thomas Hornan in this one, almost everything the Zodiac Killer hoax guy Thomas Horan claims is a lie. I heard him on some podcast and looked into his claims. He literally lies about just every detail. Sorry, I'm laughing when I read this. I just think that's... Thomas Horan wrote a book accusing Robert Graysmith of lying about everything, and someone is saying this about him. I encourage anyone thinking that the hoax theory could be legit to look into what he says. It's ridiculous. And the person leaving this comment, this was from Fash Girl. Thank you for the comment all the same. Someone has left a challenge question just there. Could you give examples of what he has lied about? I don't find his theory plausible in the end, but haven't caught any lies. And then someone else has left another comment. Please name one lie. And of course, there's no response, but I would just like to say something about that because someone else left a comment on the Drew Beeson theory dealing with Don Chaney, as well as talking about Thomas Henry Horan and the Zodiac Killer hoax theory. I don't have that one in front of me immediately, or else I'd give that person a shout out. But what they said is they find Thomas Horan and Drew Beeson both to be credible, meaning that they are not lying. They're not some people like Lyndon Lafferty or Gary Stewart or Michael Wachsel who are intentionally fabricating things, telling blatant lies so they can sell books. No, it seems like they are genuine believers in what they are saying. And obviously, both of these things cannot be true. The Zodiac Killer can't both be Don Chaney and the hoax theory to work because very specific people have been identified in the hoax theory. And I was very much tempted to do an upload on the likelihood of Don Chaney being the Zodiac Killer versus Hal Snook being the Zodiac Killer. And once again, if it were Hal Snook, we would have to have two people involved. I do not think there's any chance Hal Snook was the stabber at Lake Berryessa. Maybe the other crimes, but that's the problem, though. I do not even know if that's an appropriate pathway, because first and foremost, that isn't Thomas Horan's claim. I wish I could have known what he has lied about here, although someone did leave a comment on another previous upload saying they accused him of lying by saying the piece of Paul Stein's shirt that was mailed into the papers was removed when it was in the evidence locker, but the detectives claimed that the piece of Paul Stein's shirt had been removed from the scene, and Mel Magazine actually did some checking up on that, and what they said was, first, a piece of the shirt was removed from the taxi cab after Paul Stein's murder on October 11th, and then later on, an additional piece of the shirt could have been removed from the evidence locker. So it's possible that nobody is lying. It's just that, life can be like that way. Both sides of the story can actually have some merit and credibility, we should say. But in terms of doing something about Hal Snook versus Don Chaney as the Zodiac Killer, I don't even know if that's necessarily the most plausible way to go about this or the most beneficial way to go about this because, what I can say is Don Chaney really does match up with the psychological profile, and someone who is of above average intelligence, who is an underachiever, but we've also done an upload on Hal Snook's psychological profile, and Thomas Horan wrote the notes for those, and what he says very clearly, what does he say about Hal Snook? He was a very intelligent underachiever. Both of those guys are very similar, and I do think there is a lot of credibility in both of these things. I feel like we're getting closer to the truth when we examine something from Hal Snook. Once again, not necessarily as the person who committed all the murders. It's possible he could just be involved in the hoax theory, versus somebody like Don Chaney, very credible as well. I mean, I think that we've eliminated a lot of some of the more frivolous suspects out there. But, I mean, I think that we have learned an enormous amount about these two individuals, Hal Snook and Don Chaney, and it's just a matter of getting a little bit more concrete evidence. DNA testing, and DNA is working wonders now. We could learn new things in the future, and the side palm print on the letters, like, if we had any type of side palm print testing for Don Chaney or Hal Snook, that could reveal a lot of things. I simply don't think handwriting analysis is ever going to satisfy anybody, and perhaps if we are to discover some things like Paul Stein's wallet is in the possession of some item that was owned by some family member, then I think we would have much closer to definitive certainty about who was the Zodiac Killer. Well, that's all for me now, and thank you to everybody who's listened to this one here. And if you like this upload, you can hit the like button. It really helps out the channel. See you on Instagram for the bonus podcast. Until next time.